and agreed to abandon my efforts to buy the leased property on which his small shopping center stands. I also agreed to pay him $3,000 in cash under the table for being permitted to erect a larger, more attractive sign for the restaurant. He was smug, condescending, infuriating. He kept me there for more than an hour, though our business could have been concluded in 10 minutes, because he relished my humiliation. Last night, I could not sleep. The bed was comfortable, and the house was silent, and the air was pleasantly cool, all conditions for easy, deep sleep. But I could not stop brooding about Horace Dalco. The thought of being under his thumb for the foreseeable future was more than I could bear. I repeatedly turned the situation over in my mind, searching for a handle, for a way to obtain an advantage over him before he realized what I was doing, but no brilliant ploys occurred to me. Finally, I slipped out of bed without waking Carmen, and I went downstairs to get a glass of milk, hopeful that a calcium fix would sedate me. When I entered the kitchen, still thinking of Dalco, the cellar door was there again. Staring at it, I was very afraid, for I knew what its timely reappearance meant. I needed to deal with Horace Dalco, and I was being provided with a final solution to the problem. Invite Dalco to the house, on one pretext or another, show him the cellar, and let the darkness have him. I opened the door. I peered down the steps at the blackness below. Long dead prisoners, victims of torture, had been waiting for Nguyen Quang Phu. What would be waiting down there to seize Dalco? I shuddered. Not for Dalco. I shuddered for me. Suddenly, I understood that the darkness below wanted me, more than it wanted Phu, the torture master, or Horace Dalco. Neither of those men was much of a prize. They were destined for hell anyway. If I had not escorted Phu into the cellar, the darkness would have had him, sooner or later, when at last death visited him. Likewise, Dalco would wind up in the depths of Gehenna upon his own death. But by hurrying them along to their ultimate destination, I would be surrendering to the dark impulses within me, and would, thereby, be putting my own soul in jeopardy. Staring down the cellar stairs, I heard the darkness calling my name, welcoming me, offering me eternal communion. Its whispery voice was seductive. Its promises were sweet. The fate of my soul was still undecided, and the darkness saw the possibility of a small triumph in claiming me. I sensed that I was not yet sufficiently corrupted to belong down in the darkness. What I had done to Phu might be seen as the mere enactment of long-overdue justice, for he was a man who deserved no rewards in either this world or the next, and allowing Dalco to proceed to his predestined doom ahead of schedule would probably not condemn me to perdition. But whom might I be tempted to lure to the cellar after Horace Dalco? How many? And how often? Each time the option would get easier to take. Sooner or later, I would find myself using the cellar to rid myself of people who were only minor nuisances. Some of them might be borderline cases, people deserving of hell but with a chance of salvation, and by hurrying them along, I would be denying them the opportunity to mend their ways and remake their lives. Their damnation would be partly my responsibility. Then I, too, would be lost, and the darkness would rise up the stairs and come into the house and take me when it wished. Below, that sludge-thick distillation of a billion moonless nights whispered to me. Whispered. I stepped back and closed the door. It did not vanish. Dalco, I thought desperately, why have you been such a bastard? Why have you made me hate you? Darkness dwells within even the best of us. In the worst of us, darkness not only dwells, but reigns. I'm a good man, a hard worker, a loving and faithful husband, a stern but doting father, a good man. Yet I have human failings, not the least of which is a taste for vengeance. Part of the price that I have paid is the death of my innocence in Vietnam. There, I learned that great evil exists in the world, not in the abstract, but in the flesh. And when evil men tortured me, I was contaminated by the contact. I developed a thirst for vengeance. I tell myself that I dare not succumb to the easy solutions offered by the cellar. Where would it start? Someday, after sending a score of men and women into the lightless chamber below, I would be so thoroughly corrupted that it would be easy to use the cellar for what had previously seemed unthinkable. For instance, what if Carmen and I had an argument? Would I devolve to the point where I could ask her to explore those lower regions with me? What if my children displeased me, as God knows children frequently do? Where would I draw the line? And would the line be constantly redrawn? I am a good man. Although occasionally providing darkness with a habitat, I have never provided it with a kingdom. I am a good man. But the temptation is great. I have begun to prepare a list of people who have, at one time or another, made my life difficult. I don't intend to do anything about them, of course. The list is merely a game. I will make it and then tear it to pieces and flush the pieces down the toilet. I'm a good man. This list means nothing. The cellar door will stay closed forever. I will not open it again. I swear by all that's holy. I am a good man. The list is longer than I had expected. The scariest thing I know. When I was 12 years old in 7th grade, I was a disaster waiting to happen. I wasn't the equivalent of a simple flood or a mere train wreck. I was an earthquake in ragged sneakers, a tornado in patched jeans, ready to bring tremendous ruin down on myself and on everyone around me. I didn't realize I was a loser. I thought I was smart and tough. I was so smart I knew school was a concentration camp where they brainwashed kids to be good citizens and spiked the lousy cafeteria food with Be Nice pills. To me, being an upstanding citizen meant working your whole life for nickels and dimes and having no fun. I preferred to be bad. And tough? Other kids called me Stony because I was hard. You didn't want to mess with me. I had my secret smokes, lucky strikes, the smokes of tough men. And recently I'd started carrying a knife, 5-inch blade, gravity release. I hadn't used it in a fight, not yet, because so far I'd never been in danger of losing with my fists alone. Looking back, I can remember the anger that was in me, the storm of violence waiting to break. But I can't feel it anymore, not the way I felt it then. The 12-year-old me is more unknowable than a stranger. He's an alien from another world. I'm grateful I didn't grow up to be him. My name is Nicholas Loftman. My friends call me Nick, or Nicky. No one has called me Stony since I was 12, 38 years ago. Halloween 1963 was the night my life changed forever. I didn't believe in spooks and such. The world held no mystery for me in those days. I saw everything simply, clearly. There were people who always got what they wanted, and people who never did. I was determined to be one of the always gots, not one of the never dids. I intended to take what I wanted, no matter what the risks. That Halloween, most other 12-year-olds were still doing the witch, vampire, skeleton thing, toting huge shopping bags door to door, hoping to fill them with enough candy to rot their teeth before Thanksgiving. I was looking for bigger loot. My English teacher, Mrs. Carson, was going to be away from home for the evening. She and her husband, who taught 12th grade English, were chaperoning a corny goblin hop at the high school. I figured I could jimmy a window at their place, without much chance of getting caught, and see if I could find some loose money, or anything else I wanted. I didn't have anything against Mrs. Carson. She never sent me to detention. She tried her best to teach me. And I didn't even know her husband, though I did know he was a coin collector. And I figured maybe there would be some significant change lying around. The word burglary never entered my head. As I saw it, if I had the nerve to take something I wanted, then it was rightfully mine. In school we had learned about evolution, the survival of the fittest, predators and prey. I was fit, strong for my age, bold. So, hey, I was just fulfilling nature's plan. Late in the afternoon that Halloween, nature's plan had to be put on hold when my mother informed me that I had to accompany my little brother Dink when he went trick-or-treating. By 12, I was a thief and a bully, but I couldn't say no to my mother when she asked for my help. I was perpetually angry with her. I'm ashamed to say that she embarrassed me, that I had no respect for her, that I shrank from her touch, and was often rude to her. But when she asked me to do a chore, I did it. Never with a smile, always with a display of contempt, but I did the chore. This curious obedience streak frustrated and puzzled me. I didn't understand why she had this power over me, because back then I didn't realize that I loved her. This is very hard to tell you. Very hard. But if you're to believe what follows, I need to be painfully honest and admit that she embarrassed me because she was constantly tired, endlessly worried about one thing or another, every day counting pennies and cutting corners and planning for crises that might never come. We were poor, and I blamed her for our poverty, because it seemed to me that she had just accepted it. In reality, she was tired all the time because she worked 6 and sometimes 7 days a week as a waitress at the Good Plate Diner out on the State Highway. She sewed her own clothes, and some of ours, and she could stretch a grocery dollar until it would kill you if it snapped. She was only 30 then, but worn thin and pale with care. My father walked out on us the year that Dink was born, when I was 3, and we never saw him again. I blamed her for that, too, because my father wasn't there to take the brunt of my anger. And even Stony Loftman, young thug in the making, wasn't heartless enough to blame his brother Dink. His name wasn't really Dink. Walter John Loftman. He wanted to be called Wally, but I called him Dink because the name peeved him. The world over, little brothers, he was 9 that October, are an irritant to boys on the cusp of adolescence. Often, however, I was prickly with Dink because he so strongly resembled our mother, while I was the image of my father, whom I knew from photographs. I hated my father, and loathed my resemblance to him. Mother tried to counsel me out of my hatred. She said my old man wasn't evil, not even bad, really, just weak. She forgave him, but I would not. The creep had abandoned us for many reasons, but the deciding event had been Dink. My brother's left side was unfinished when he was born. His left arm measured 2 inches shorter than his right and had 3 fingers. His left leg, withered, seated in a distorted hip socket, required a brace to support him. One thing I can be proud of: I never made fun of Dink's disabilities, or expected less of him because of them. Anyone who dared to tease him carried my signature bruises for a week. Yet I remained prickly with Dink, impatient, uncommunicative. An hour after sundown we set out, using Mother's black cardigan as a tunic and a pillow as a hump, wearing a dime store mask. Dink had dressed for trick-or-treating as the Hunchback of Notre Dame. He was never self-conscious about his arm and leg. Now it tickled him to emphasize his deformities. I wore no costume, none of that kid stuff. I was strictly Dink's chaperone, bent on hustling him along, getting his treat bag filled so I would be free to search Mrs. Carson's house while the Halloween hop was still hopping. In those days, in our quiet town, kids could safely go roaming on Halloween without clench-jawed adults accompanying them. The candy collected didn't have to be fluoroscoped for hidden razor blades or chemically analyzed for poisons. But, of course, that was in another century. Trick-or-treaters banded together in groups to goof with one another and to play at being spooky. We walked 4 blocks from the trailer park where we lived before we encountered others in costume. But by the time we had traveled 2 blocks farther, there were 12 of us, some kids as young as 6, a couple as old as me. Witches, vampires, skeletons. They were the usual suspects, less convincingly monstrous than they thought they were. A little girl about Dink's age missed the point altogether. She ventured into the haunted night as an angel, dressed in white with white feathered wings. When the others ragged her mercilessly, she said, "I like being an angel, and so would you, if you were good enough to be one." This earned her even more jeers and taunts, in response to which she merely smiled and curtsied, eliciting additional mockery. One kid, masquerading as Death, had a genuinely creepy costume. He was shorter than me, maybe 10 years old. He wore a black robe that dragged on the ground, a deep hood over his head. He had painted his face black so it vanished in the hood. The long sleeves of his robe hid his hands, but from time to time he raised an arm and pointed at one of the other kids, and from the sleeve came the bony fingers of a skeleton. No doubt a
plastic novelty shop gag that he was holding in his real hand. 3 things about his performance were genius. First, he never spoke. No amount of taunting or wheedling could pry a sound from him. Second, he stank like death. Perhaps with a chemistry hobby set, this weirdo had concocted a putrescent stench and sprinkled it on his rub. We recognized some of the kids, some we didn't. Kid Death, as I came to think of him, surely seemed to be a stranger, because neither Dink nor I knew anyone who had this cool an imagination. From house to house we proceeded, and the trick-or-treaters grew increasingly terrified of Kid Death. They were convinced the stinky one was real, not one of them, but the Grim Reaper in miniature. I could have grabbed the little geek, wrestled him to the ground, and yanked his hood back, but he was smaller than me. And as bad as I was, I never fought anyone unless he was my size or bigger. Picking on someone smaller was a sign of weakness, and I was not my father. Besides, I just wanted to move this show along and get to Mrs. Carson's place. The third bit of genius in Kid Death's performance: he wasn't carrying a shopping bag, and he showed no interest in candy. He held back at the periphery of the group, watching, pointing. If he didn't want candy, then the logical conclusion among the small fry in our group was that he was really deaf, and he wanted their souls. Before long, Dink was staying particularly close to me. In fact, all the kids were huddling around me. "He's no kid," said Dink. "He's real." "Get real," I told him. "He's no boogeyman." Just then, when Kid Death turned to us, moonlight flared in the whites of his eyes. The moon was full, pocked and yellow, with rags of clouds trailing from it like the face of a mummy revealed between unraveling bandages. His eyes, therefore, were yellow and unearthly. Pent-up terror exploded through the group. When yellow-eyed Kid Death pointed at them with his bony hand, the Munchkins screamed and ran, having worked themselves into a state of high anxiety. I lost Dink. Then I saw his small form with the fake hump and the real limp stumbling into the street. I saw, too, the onrushing truck. Strong as I was, tough as I was, I couldn't reach him fast enough to sweep him out of danger. I ran toward him, knowing it was hopeless. That's when time stopped. Not for me, but it stopped for Kid Death and all the trick-or-treaters. They were frozen in mid-step, in mid-breath, like statues. The clouds ceased unraveling across the face of the moon. The breeze died in an instant, and not one leaf stirred on the trees. The world was suddenly without sound. Not a tick, not a click, not a whisper. I thought I'd gone deaf. Time stopped for Dink, too, and for the speeding truck. At first, I alone was moving in a petrified world. But then I saw the little girl, dressed as an angel. She moved faster than I could, straight for Dink. She was flying. She swept Dink off the street, carried him past the truck, and time started moving again. The truck roared by in a blast of wind, and all the Munchkins were screaming, and Dink was safe with the white-winged girl on the other side of the street. By the time I reached my brother, the girl was gone. I never saw her vanish. I hugged Dink so hard. When the other trick-or-treaters gathered around, I plucked off Kid Death's hood. He was a boy we knew, a geeky 6th grader. Dink didn't remember the angel girl. He thought I was the one who pulled him out of the path of the truck. That's what he still believes, all these years after that night. Indeed, no one remembered her but me. She had been sent to save Dink. But even back then, hard case Stony Loffman realized she had been sent to save him, too. Which is why time didn't stop for me, why I was allowed to see her fly. I never went to Mrs. Carson's house that night. I never stole again. I threw away the knife. Dink grew up to be a doctor of biology and a medical researcher whose discoveries have saved uncountable lives. Me? I've become a popular writer of suspense novels. Scary stuff. Married with 2 kids of my own. I was successful enough, early enough, to give my mom 10 years of easy living before she died. Because of what I write, people often ask me, what is the scariest thing that's ever happened to me? I tell them instead, the scariest thing I know. That there is a purpose to life, and meaning, and that everything we do counts in the end. This is the scariest thing I know, but also the most wonderful.
We Three. 1. Jonathan, Jessica, and I rolled our father through the dining room and across the fancy Old English kitchen. We had some trouble getting father through the back door because he was rather rigid. This is no comment on his bearing or temperament, though he could be a chilly bastard when he wanted. Now he was stiff quite simply because rigor mortis had tightened his muscles and hardened his flesh. We were not, however, to be deterred. We kicked at him until he bent in the middle and popped through the doorframe. We dragged him across the porch and down the 6 steps to the lawn. "He weighs a ton," Jonathan said, mopping his sweat-streaked brow, puffing and puffing. "Not a ton," Jessica said. "Less than 200 pounds. Although we are triplets and are surprisingly similar in many ways, we differ from one another in a host of minor details. For example, Jessica is by far the most pragmatic of us, while Jonathan likes to exaggerate, fantasize, and daydream. I am somewhere between their 2 extremes. A pragmatic daydreamer? "What now?" Jonathan asked, wrinkling his face in disgust and nodding toward the corpse on the grass. "Burn him," Jessica said. Her pretty lips made a thin pencil line on her face. Her long yellow hair caught the morning sun and glimmered. The day was perfect, and she was the most beautiful part of it. "Burn 'em all up." "Shouldn't we drag Mother out and burn the 2 of them at the same time?" Jonathan asked. "It would save work." "If we make a big pyre, the flames might dance too high," she said, "and we don't want a stray spark to catch the house on fire." "We have our choice of all the houses in the world," Jonathan said, spreading his arms to indicate the beach resort around us, Massachusetts beyond the resort, the nation past the state's perimeters, the world. Jessica only glared at him. "Aren't I right, Jerry?" Jonathan asked me. "Don't we have the whole world to live in? Isn't it silly to worry about this one old house?" "You're right," I said. "I like this house," Jessica said. Because Jessica liked this house, we stood 15 feet back from the sprawled corpse and stared at it and thought of flames and ignited it in an instant. Fire burst out of nowhere and wrapped Father in a red-orange blanket. He burned well, blackened, popped, sizzled, and fell into ashes. "I feel as if I ought to be sad," Jonathan said. Jessica grimaced. "Well, he was our father," Jonathan said. We're above cheap sentimentality. Jessica stared hard at each of us to be certain we understood this. We're a new race with new emotions and new attitudes.
I guess so. But Jonathan was not fully convinced.
Now let's get Mother, Jessica said.
Although she is only 10 years old, 6 minutes younger than Jonathan and 3 minutes younger than I, Jessica is the most forceful of us. She usually has her way. We went back into the house and got Mother.
2. The government had assigned a contingent of 12 Marines and 8 plainclothes operatives to our house. Supposedly, these men were to guard us and keep us from harm. Actually, they were there only to be sure that we remained prisoners. When we were finished with Mother, we dragged these other bodies onto the lawn and cremated them one at a time. Jonathan was exhausted. He sat down between 2 smoldering skeletons and wiped sweat and ashes from his face.
Maybe we made a big mistake.
Mistake? Jessica asked. She was immediately defensive.
Maybe we shouldn't have killed all of them, Jonathan said.
Jessica stamped one foot. Her golden ringlets of hair bounced prettily. You're a stupid bastard, Jonathan. You know what they were going to do to us. When they discovered just how far-ranging our powers were and just how fast we were acquiring new powers, they finally understood the danger we posed. They were going to kill us.
We could have killed just a few of them to make our point, Jonathan said. Did we really have to finish them all?
Jessica sighed. Look, they were like Neanderthals compared to us. We're a new race with new powers, new emotions, new attitudes. We are the most precocious children of all time. But they did have a certain brute strength, remember? Our only chance was to act without warning. And we did.
Jonathan looked around at the black patches of grass. It's going to be so much work. It's taken us all morning to dispense with these few. We'll never get the whole world cleaned up.
Before long, we'll learn how to levitate the bodies, Jessica said. I feel a smidgen of that power already. Maybe we'll even learn how to teleport them from one place to another. Things will be easier then. Besides, we aren't going to clean up the whole world, just the parts of it we'll want to use for the next few years. By that time, the weather and the rats will have done the rest of the job for us.
I guess you're right, Jonathan said. But I knew he remained doubtful, and I shared some of his doubt. Certainly, we 3 are higher on the ladder of evolution than anyone who came before us. We are fledgling mind readers, fortune tellers, capable of out-of-body experiences whenever we desire them. We have that trick with the fire, converting thought energy into a genuine physical holocaust. Jonathan can control the flow of small streams of water, a talent he finds most amusing whenever I try to urinate. Though he is one of the new race, he is still strangely enchanted by childish pranks. Jessica can accurately predict the weather. I have a special empathy with animals. Dogs come to me, as do cats and birds, and all manner of awful dropping creatures. And of course, we can put a stop to the life of any plant or animal just by thinking death at it. Like we thought death at all the rest of humanity. Perhaps, considering Darwin's theories, we were destined to destroy these new Neanderthals once we developed the ability. But I cannot rid myself of the nagging doubt. I feel that, somehow, we will suffer for the destruction of the old race.
That's backward thinking, Jessica said.
She had read my mind, of course. Her telepathic talents are stronger and more developed than either Jonathan's or mine.
Their deaths meant nothing. We cannot feel remorse. We are the new ones, with new emotions and new hopes and new dreams and new rules.
Sure, I said. You're right.
3.
Wednesday, we went down to the beach and burned the corpses of the dead sunbathers. We all like the sea, and we do not want to be without a stretch of unpolluted sand. Putrefying bodies make for a very messy beach. When we finished the job, Jonathan and I were weary, but Jessica wanted to do the nasty. Children our age shouldn't be capable of that, Jonathan said.
But we are capable, Jessica said. We were meant to do it, and I want to. Now.
So we did the nasty. Jonathan and her, then me and her. She wanted more, but neither of us cared to oblige. Jessica stretched out on the beach. Her shapeless, slender body was white against the white sand.
We'll wait, she said.
For what? Jonathan asked.
For the two of you to be ready again.
4 weeks after the end of the world, Jonathan and I were alone on the beach, soaking up the sun. He was oddly silent for a while, almost as if he was afraid to speak. At last he said, "Do you think it's normal for a girl her age to be always wanting like that, even if she is one of the new race?" "No." "She seems driven." "Yes." "There's a purpose we don't grasp." He was right. I sensed it too. "Trouble," he said. "Maybe." "Trouble coming." "Maybe. But what trouble can there be after the end of the world?" 5 2 months after the end of the world and the burning of our parents, when Jonathan and I were getting bored with the house and wanted to strike out for more exotic places, Jessica let us in on the big news.
We can't leave here just yet, she said. Her voice was especially forceful. We can't leave for several more months. I'm pregnant.
6 We became aware of that fourth consciousness when Jessica was in her 5th month of pregnancy. We all woke in the middle of the night, drenched with sweat, nauseated, sensing this new person. "It's the baby," Jonathan said. "A boy." "Yes," I said, wincing at the psychic impact of the new being. "And although he's inside of you, Jessica, he's aware. He's unborn but completely aware." Jessica was racked with pain. She whimpered helplessly.
7 The baby will be our equal, not our superior, Jessica insisted. And I won't listen to any more of this nonsense of yours, Jonathan.
She was only a child herself, yet she was swollen with child. She was getting to be more grotesque with each passing day. "How can you know he isn't our superior?" Jonathan asked. "None of us can read his mind. None of us can."
"New species don't evolve that fast," she said.
"What about us?"
"Besides, he's safe. He came from us," she said.
Apparently, she thought that this truth made Jonathan's theory even more the lie. "We came from our parents," Jonathan said. "And where are they? Suppose we aren't the new race. Suppose we're a brief intermediate step, the cocoon stage between caterpillar and butterfly. Maybe the baby is—"
"We have nothing to fear from the baby," she insisted, patting her revolting stomach with both hands. "Even if what you say is true, he needs us, for reproduction."
"He needs you," Jonathan said. "He doesn't need us." I sat and listened to the argument, not knowing what to think. In truth, I found it all a bit amusing, even as it frightened me. I tried to make them see the humor. Maybe we have this wrong. Maybe the baby is the second coming, the one Yeats wrote about in his poem, the beast slouching toward Bethlehem to be born. Neither of them thought that was funny. "I never could stand Yeats," Jonathan said.
"Yes,"
Jessica said.
"Such a gloomy ass he was. Anyway, we're above superstitions like that. We're the new race with new emotions and new dreams and new hopes and new rules."
"This is a serious threat, Jerry," Jonathan said. "It's not anything to joke about." And they were at it again, screaming at each other, quite like Mother and Father used to do when they couldn't make the household budget work. Some things never change. 8 The baby woke us repeatedly every night, as though it enjoyed disturbing our rest.
In Jessica's 7th month of pregnancy, toward dawn, we were all jolted awake by a thunder of thought energy that poured from the womb-wrapped being-to-be. "I think I was wrong," Jonathan said. "About what?" I asked. I could barely see him in the dark bedroom. "It's a girl, not a boy," he said. I probed out with my mind and tried to get a picture of the creature inside Jessica's belly. It resisted me successfully, for the most part, just as it resisted Jonathan's and Jessica's psychic proddings. But I was sure it was male, not female. I said so. Jessica sat up in bed, her back against the headboard, both hands on her moving stomach. "You're wrong, both of you. I think it's a boy and girl, or maybe neither one." Jonathan turned on the bedside lamp in the house by the sea and looked at her. "What is that supposed to mean?" She winced as the child within her struck out hard against her. "I'm in closer contact with it than either of you. I sense into it. It isn't like us." "Then I was right," Jonathan said. Jessica said nothing. "If it's both sexes or neither, it doesn't need any of us," he said. He turned off the light again. There was nothing else to do. "Maybe we could kill it," I said. "We couldn't," Jessica said. "It's too powerful." "Jesus," Jonathan said. "We can't even read its mind. If it can hold off all three of us like that, it can protect itself for sure. Jesus." In the darkness, as the blasphemy echoed in the room, Jessica said, "Don't use that word, Jonathan. It's beneath us. We're above those old superstitions. We're the new breed. We have new emotions, new beliefs, new rules." "For another month or so," I said.
Ollie's hands. The July night was hot. The air against Ollie's poems made him aware of the discomfort of the city's sweltering residents. Millions of people, wishing for winter. Even in the cruelest weather, however, even on a bitterly cold night filled with dry January wind, Ollie's hands would have been soft, moist, warm, and sensitive. His thin fingers were tapered in an extraordinary manner. When he gripped anything, his fingers seemed to fuse with the surface of the object. When he let it go, the release was like a sigh. Every night, regardless of the season, Ollie visited the unlighted alleyway behind Stasnik's restaurant, where he searched for the accidentally discarded silverware in the 3 large, overflowing garbage bins. Because Stasnik himself believed in quality, and because his prices were high, the tableware was expensive enough to make Ollie's undignified rooting worthwhile. Every 2 weeks, he managed to sense out enough pieces to constitute a matched set, which he sold to one of several used furniture stores in exchange for wine money. Recovered tableware was only one source of his funds. In his own way, Ollie was a clever man. On that Tuesday night in early July, his cleverness was tested to its limits. When he made his nightly trip into the alley to sense out the knives, forks, and spoons, he found instead the unconscious girl. She was lying against the last dumpster, face toward the brick wall, eyes closed, hands drawn across her small breasts as if she were a sleeping child. Her cheap, tight, short dress revealed that she was no child. Her pale flesh glimmered like a soft flame viewed through smoked glass. Otherwise, Ollie could not see much of her. "Miss?" he asked, leaning toward her. She didn't respond. She didn't move. He knelt beside her, shook her, but was unable to wake her. When he rolled her onto her back to look at her face, something rattled. Striking a match, he discovered that she had been curled against the paraphernalia of a junkie's habit. Syringe, charred spoon, metal cup, half-used candle, several packets of white powder wrapped in plastic and then in foil. He might have left her and continued searching for spoons.
He didn't like or understand snowbirds, being strictly a man of spirits himself, but the match flame revealed her face, and thereby ensured his concern. She had a broad forehead, well-set eyes, a pert and freckled nose, full lips that somehow promised both erotic pleasure and childlike innocence. When the match went out and the darkness rushed in again, Ollie knew that he could not leave her there, for she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen. "Miss?" he asked, shaking her shoulder again. She did not respond. He looked toward both ends of the alleyway, but he did not see anyone who might misinterpret his intentions. Thus assured, he bent close to her and felt for a heartbeat, found a weak one, held his moist palm close to her nostrils, and detected the barest exhalation of warm breath. She was alive. He stood and wiped his palms on his rumpled, dirty trousers, cast one mournful glance at the unplumbed bins of waste, then lifted her. She weighed little, and he carried her in his arms like a groom crossing the threshold with his bride, although he gave no thought to the carnal aspect of the ritual. Heart pounding with the unaccustomed exertion, he took her to the far end of the alley, hurried across the deserted avenue, and disappeared into the mouth of another unlighted back street. 10 minutes later, he unlocked the door of his basement room and carried her inside. He put her on the bed, locked the door, and switched on a low-watt bulb in a newspaper-shaded junk lamp beside the bed. She was still breathing. He gazed at her, wondering what to do next. Thus far he had been purposeful. Now he was confused. Frustrated by his inability to think clearly, he went outside again, locked the door after himself, and retraced his course to the rear of the restaurant. He located her purse and filled it with the skag and the other items. Possessed by a strange anxiety that he could not understand at all, he returned to his basement room. He had utterly forgotten the tableware in Stasnik's garbage. Sitting beside the bed, in a straight-backed chair, Ollie pored through the contents of the purse. He removed the syringe and candle, destroyed them, and threw them into the waste can. In the bathroom, he ripped open the packets of heroin and flushed the contents down the toilet. She had used the metal cup to hold the candle with which she cooked each batch of dope. He placed the cup on the floor and methodically stamped it flat. He washed his hands, dried them on a tattered hotel towel, and felt much better. The girl's breathing had grown shallower and less rhythmic. Her face was gray, and drops of perspiration were strung like bright beads across her forehead. Standing over her, Ollie realized that she was dying, and he was frightened. He folded his arms so his long-fingered hands were hidden in his armpits. The fleshy pads of his fingertips were excessively moist. Dimly, he was aware that his hands could perform more useful tricks than locating silverware buried in mounds of garbage, but he did not want to admit to their capabilities. That way lay danger. He retrieved a gallon of wine from the rickety cardboard clothes cupboard and drank straight from the jug. It tasted like water. He knew that he was not going to find release in wine, not with the girl lying on his bed, not with his hands trembling as they were. He put the wine away. Ollie despised using his hands for anything but earning wine money, but now he had no choice. Other, more basic motivations drove him to act. The girl was beautiful. The smooth, clear lines of her face were so symmetrical that even the hue of sickness could not much detract from them. Like a delicate web, her beauty caught him, held him. He followed his hands to the bed as if he were a blind man, feeling for obstacles in a strange room. For his hands to perform properly, he needed to undress her. She wore no underclothes. Her breasts were small, firm, high. Her waist was too small, and the bones in her hips were sharp, though even malnutrition hardly detracted from the sublime beauty of her legs. Ollie appreciated her only as an objet d'art, not as a source of physical gratification. He was a man ignorant of women. Until now, he had lived in a sexless world, driven there by hands that any lover would instantly have recognized as more than ordinary. He placed his hands at her temples, smoothed her hair, and traced his fleshy fingertips across her forehead, cheeks, jawline, chin. He felt the pulse at her neck, gently pressed her breasts, stomach, and legs, seeking the cause of her illness. In a moment, he knew. She had overdosed. He also perceived a truth that he did not want to believe. The overdose had been intentional. His hands ached. He touched her again, moved his open palms in lazy circles until he was not sure where his hands ended and her fair skin began, until they seemed to have melted together. They might have been two clouds of smoke, blending into one. Half an hour later, she was no longer comatose, merely sleeping. Gently, he turned her onto her stomach and worked his hands along her back, shoulders, buttocks, thighs, finishing what he had begun. He traced her spinal cord, massaged her scalp, blanked from his mind all appreciation of her form, the better to let the power seep out of him and into her. 15 minutes later, he had not only remedied her current condition, but had permanently cured her of her desire for drugs. If she even thought of shooting up again, she would become violently ill. He had seen to that. With his hands. Then he leaned back in his chair and slept. He bolted out of his chair an hour later, pursued by nightmares that he could not identify. He went quickly to the door, found it still locked, and peered through the curtains. He had expected to see someone lurking there, but he found only the night. No one had seen him use his hands. The girl was still asleep. As he pulled the sheets over her, he realized that he didn't even know her name. In her purse, he found identification. Annie Grice, 26, unmarried. Nothing more. No address or relatives' names. He lifted a glass bead necklace, but received no images from those small, smooth spheres. He decided that the necklace was a recent purchase, imbued with none of her aura, and he put it aside. In her well-worn wallet, he discovered a wealth of impressions, a fiercely compressed picture of the last several years of Annie's life. Her first cocaine purchase, first use, subsequent dependence, her first time with Skag, dependence, addiction, theft to maintain the habit, jobs in less reputable bars, hustling drinks, prostitution that she called something else to satisfy her troubled conscience, prostitution that she called prostitution, finally, irrevocably, a disassociation from life and society, a solidified loneliness that welcomed the release of death. He put down the wallet. He was drenched with perspiration. He wanted wine, but knew that it would not give him surcease. Not this time. Besides, his curiosity had not been fully satisfied. How had Annie Grice become the woman that the 7-year-old wallet testified she was? He found an old ring, family heirloom, in her purse, held it, and let the images push into him. At first they did not concern Annie. When he saw that he was sensing back to the earliest history of the ring, to previous owners of it, he let his mind slide forward in time until Annie appeared. She was 7. The orphanage official had just given her what few artifacts remained of her heritage after a fire had destroyed her home and parents 6 months before. After that, her life was a string of depressing events. She was shy and became the target of malicious playmates. Her bashfulness compounded her loneliness and kept her friendless through her formative years. Her first love affair was a disaster that left her afraid of human contact more than ever before. With no money for college, she went from one clerking job to another, unhappy, confined, alone. In time, she tried to overcome her timidity with a brash aggressiveness, which achieved nothing but the acquaintance of a morally bankrupt young man named Benny, with whom she lived for a year, and with whom she first snorted coke. After that, her addiction, a desperate attempt to escape from loneliness and lovelessness, followed the relentless pattern that Ollie had seen when sensing the images that permeated her tattered wallet. He dropped the ring and got his jug of wine. He drank until he mercifully escaped the depression that was not really his, but Annie's. He slept. The girl woke him. She sat up in bed, stared at him where he slumped against the wall, and cried out in alarm. Ollie got up and swayed toward her, blinking stupidly, sleepily, drunkenly. "What am I doing here?" she demanded, clearly frightened. "What did you do to me?" Ollie said nothing. Silence was his savior. He found it quite impossible to speak to anyone. He may have been mute, or he may have been afraid of words. His hands were trembling, moist and pink. He shook his head and smiled nervously, hoping that she understood that he wanted only to help her. Apparently she grasped the innocence of his intentions, for she looked less frightened. Frowning, she pulled the sheets to her neck to cover her nakedness. "I'm not dead, even though I overdosed." Ollie smiled, nodded, and wiped his hands on his shirt. Her eyes widened with an awful terror as she inspected her needle-tracked arms. Hers was a terror of life, a fear of existence. Despairing that her attempt at suicide had failed, she began to sob and wail, head thrown back, hair a golden frame about her white face. He reached her quickly, touched her, and put her to sleep. Sobered, he went to the door, peered out at the early morning light that touched the shabby concrete steps, and closed the curtains again, satisfied that her cries had not alerted anyone. In the bathroom, he splashed cold water on his face and wondered what to do next. He even considered carrying her back to the alleyway where he'd found her, to abandon her to her own devices. But he couldn't do that. He didn't know why he couldn't, and he didn't attempt to reason it out, because he was afraid of the answer that he might discover. Drying his face on a filthy hand towel, Ollie realized that he was a sorry sight. He bathed, shaved, and dressed in clean clothes. He still looked like a vagrant, but a vagrant by choice rather than by chance. A disillusioned artist, perhaps. Or, as in certain old movies, a rich man escaping from the boring responsibilities of wealth and position. He was surprised by this fanciful turn of thought. He considered himself a man of routine and restricted vision. Unsettled, he turned from his reflection in the bathroom mirror and went into the main room to check on the girl. Sleeping, she was serene, pure. He would let her sleep a while yet. 3 hours later, after cleaning the 2 small rooms, Ollie changed her sheets while she slept. Even while admitting the impossibility of the notion, he toyed with the prospect of keeping her asleep and tending to her for years, as if he were a nurse and she were his comatose patient. He would be happy doing that, perhaps happier than he had ever been in his life to date. But now he was hungry, and he knew that she would be hungry too when she woke. He left the apartment, locking the door behind him. 2 blocks away, at a small grocery, he bought more food in one order than he had ever done before. $38.12, the cashier said. He did not conceal his disdain. Clearly he felt that Ollie could not pay. Ollie raised a hand, touched his forehead, and stared hard at the cashier. The cashier blinked, smiled tentatively, and folded his hand over empty air. "Out of $40, he said. He carefully placed the non-existent currency in the cash register, handed Ollie the proper change, and bagged the food. On his way home, Ollie was uneasy, because he had never before used his power to cheat anyone. If the girl hadn't come along, he would have finished his previous night's work at the garbage bins, perhaps completing another set of flatware, and would have gone on to other tasks like sensing out dropped coins in subway stations, earning a buck here and there. Therefore, the responsibility for this deceit was not entirely his. Nevertheless, dark portents of judgmental disaster plagued him. At home he prepared dinner, stew, salad, fresh fruit, and woke Annie. She regarded him strangely as he pointed at the laden table. He sensed her blooming terror, a red flower. He swept his hand to take in the cleaned and ordered room, and he smiled encouragingly. The girl sat up, propelled into her nightmare again, the cruel nightmare of being alive, and she shrieked in misery. Ollie raised his hands imploringly, tried to speak. Couldn't. Blood rushed to her face as she sucked a deeper breath and tried to pull herself out of the bed. He was forced to lay hands on her and put her to sleep again. Tucking her in, he knew that he had been naive to imagine that she would be a different girl, with fewer fears and more composure, simply because he had bathed himself, shaved, cleaned the apartment, and cooked dinner. She would be different only if he helped her, which would take time, hard work, and sacrifice. He threw the food away. He was no longer hungry. Throughout the long night, he sat by the bed, elbows propped on his knees, his head held between his hands. The tips of his fingers seemed to merge with his temples while his palms lay against his cheeks. He sensed into her, sensed her despair, her hope, her dreams, her ambition, her limitations, her joys, her hard-won knowledge, her persistent misconceptions, and her moments of intellectual surety. He dwelt in the center of her soul, which was, by turns, beautifully in bloom and withered. In the morning he used the bathroom, drank 2 glasses of water, and helped her to drink even while keeping her more than half asleep. Then he settled